salt curing. Salt is older than every civilization that has ever used it. The Amish still rely on it as their first line of defense against spoilage. The science behind it is simple. Salt draws moisture out of meat through osmosis, a process in which water is pulled through the meat's tissue toward the salt. Bacteria need water to survive. Remove the water, and they die. But the Amish don't just sprinkle salt on a cut and call it done. Instead of using ordinary table salt, they use coarse salt, which dissolves more slowly. Because of this, it penetrates deeper into thick cuts like ham or pork belly, pulling moisture out layer by layer. The meat then sits buried in a wooden box or ceramic crock. Smaller cuts like bacon and pork belly need only a few days, while larger cuts like whole hams can require several weeks. The temperature during this period is critical. Too warm, and bacteria multiply faster than the salt can stop them. This is the reason the Amish time their butchering season accordingly, almost always in late autumn when temperatures naturally range from 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A properly salt-cured ham can last over a year without refrigeration. Smoking. Smoke does two things at once. It dries the meat's surface and coats it with a layer of antimicrobial compounds, which are basically chemicals produced when wood burns that are hostile to bacteria. The Amish perform this process in their smokehouses, which are built of wood or brick. In there, the meat hangs from small structures for hours, sometimes even days. The fire underneath burns low and slow because high heat would cook the meat, but low heat, combined with continuous smoke, preserves it. When it comes to the wood, they often use hickory or fruit woods and match it to the cut. Hickory produces a strong, bold flavor that is used for pork. Apple and cherry woods burn milder and sweeter, which pairs well with poultry. They do this because different woods produce different compounds when they burn, which affect both flavor and how long the meat stays preserved. The choice of wood is as deliberate as the choice of cut. The Amish use two approaches for smoking depending on the season. Cold smoking, done below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, preserves without cooking. Hot smoking, done above 165 degrees, cooks and preserves at the same time. Properly smoked meat can last several months without refrigeration. Sugar curing. While salt preserves, sugar transforms the meat. When the Amish add sugar to their curing mixture, something changes in the meat. See, the sugar draws out moisture just like salt does, but it also feeds a specific type of bacteria, the kind that produces lactic acid, which is hostile to the bacteria that cause spoilage. The most common ratio is 2 parts salt to 1 part sugar, usually brown sugar or molasses. Brown sugar adds a mild sweetness that penetrates the meat over days. Molasses goes deeper, producing a darker, more complex flavor profile. Sugar curing is used almost exclusively on pork, specifically hams and bacon. The fat in pork absorbs the sugar compounds differently than lean meat does, because fat is more porous than lean muscle, producing a caramelized outer layer during smoking or cooking that seals the surface. A sugar-cured ham that is also smoked afterward can last up to 18 months without refrigeration. Vinegar brining. Vinegar is essentially controlled spoilage. It is what happens when bacteria convert alcohol into acetic acid, and that same acidity that makes vinegar sour is what makes it lethal to other bacteria. The Amish submerge cuts of meat, typically sausages and fish, into a brine of vinegar, water, salt, and spices. The acid penetrates the meat and lowers its pH, making the environment inside the meat too hostile for most spoilage bacteria to survive. Apple cider vinegar is the most common choice. It is mild enough not to overpower the meat, but acidic enough to do the job. White vinegar works faster but leaves a sharper taste. The Amish typically add garlic, peppercorns, and bay leaves to the brine, not just for flavor, but also because these spices have antimicrobial properties. The meat sits submerged for days. The longer it sits, the deeper the acid penetrates. Vinegar-brined meat stored in a cool cellar can last several weeks, sometimes months. Lard preservation. The Amish render lard by slowly heating pork fat until it melts into a clear, golden liquid. The process drives out all moisture, and without moisture, bacteria have nothing to work with. The meat is cooked first, then packed tightly into a ceramic crock. The rendered lard is then poured over it, filling every gap and sealing the surface completely. As the lard cools, it solidifies into an airtight layer that simultaneously cuts off oxygen and moisture. Bacteria need both to survive. This method works best with pork, ribs, chops, and sausages specifically. The fat of the lard and the fat within the meat bind together during the sealing process, which is why the flavor of lard-preserved meat is noticeably richer than meat preserved by any other method. Stored in a cool root cellar, lard-preserved meat can last up to 6 months. Root cellar storage. A root cellar is not a preservation method on its own, but it is what makes every other method work longer. The Amish dig their root cellars into the earth, typically beneath the farmhouse or into the side of a hill. The ground acts as natural insulation, keeping the interior at a stable temperature between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what happens above ground. That temperature range is precise for a reason. Below 32 degrees, meat freezes and texture suffers. Above 40 degrees, bacterial growth accelerates. Between those two numbers, spoilage slows to a near standstill. Humidity matters as much as temperature. Too dry and cured, meats crack and lose flavor. Too wet and mold takes hold. The Amish manage this by storing the cellar with both dry and moisture-retaining produce, naturally balancing the humidity without any mechanical intervention. Cured hams hung in a well-built root cellar can last the entire winter and into the following spring. Outdoor freezing. Winter in Amish country is not an inconvenience. It is a tool. And here is how it works. When temperatures drop consistently below freezing, the Amish move their larger cuts of meat outside. Freshly butchered hogs, sides of beef, and whole poultry are hung from barn rafters or placed on elevated wooden racks where the cold air can circulate freely around them. The timing for this process is deliberate. This is why butchering season in Amish communities happens almost exclusively in November and December, when temperatures are cold enough to freeze meat quickly but stable enough to keep it frozen consistently. A sudden warm spell can ruin weeks of work. To protect against moisture, the meat is wrapped in breathable materials like burlap or muslin. These allow cold air to penetrate while keeping rain and snow off the surface. Airtight wrapping would trap moisture, accelerating spoilage. Meat frozen this way can last through the entire winter, sometimes 3 to 4 months, without any further treatment. Drying. Water is where bacteria live. Remove it completely and the meat becomes inhospitable to anything that would spoil it. For this method, the Amish cut meat into uniform strips so thin that air can reach the center. The strips are salted first, which initiates moisture removal before drying even begins. They are then hung in a warm, well-ventilated space, typically a barn or a dedicated drying shed, where airflow does the work over several days. Temperature and airflow are the two variables that determine success. Too humid, and the meat rots before it dries. Too hot, and the outside dries faster than the inside, trapping moisture in the center where bacteria can still thrive. The Amish dry their meat in late summer or early autumn, when warm temperatures and low humidity align naturally. The end result is hard, dense, and shelf-stable. Dried meat can be eaten as is or rehydrated in soups and stews months later. Properly dried meat can last up to 6 months without refrigeration. Pressure canning. Boiling water reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not hot enough to kill every dangerous bacterium. Clostridium botulinum, a bacterium that produces one of the most potent natural toxins known, survives at that temperature. Even tiny amounts of this toxin can be lethal, and the illness it causes, botulism, attacks the nervous system and can lead to paralysis. Pressure canning solves this. By sealing meat inside a glass jar and heating it under pressure, the temperature inside the canner reaches 240 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, Clostridium botulinum is destroyed completely. The Amish pack cooked or raw meat tightly into glass jars, leaving a precise amount of headspace at the top. Too much headspace and the seal fails. Too little and the jar can crack under pressure. The jars are then processed in a pressure canner for 75 to 90 minutes, depending on the cut and jar size. What comes out is fully cooked, fully sterile meat sealed in its own broth. As a result, no refrigeration is needed. Properly pressure-canned meat can last 3 to 5 years on a cool cellar shelf. Pemmican. Pemmican is not an Amish invention. It comes from the indigenous peoples of North America, who developed it centuries before European settlers arrived. The Amish adopted it because it works better than almost anything else for long-term storage. The base is simple. Dried meat is ground or pounded into a fine powder. After that, rendered fat, usually beef tallow, is melted and mixed into the powder at a ratio of roughly 1:1 by weight. The mixture is pressed into blocks or packed into pouches and left to cool. The dried meat contributes protein. The fat provides calories and acts as a preservative, sealing the meat particles from air and moisture. Together, they create an environment where bacteria can't survive. Some Amish families add dried berries to the mixture, which introduces natural sugars and a small amount of vitamin C. This was not done for flavor alone. On a diet heavy in preserved meat, vitamin C deficiency was a real concern. Pemmican stored in a cool, dry place can last several years without spoiling. Brine curing. While dry salt curing works from the outside in, brine curing works from every direction at once. Instead of packing meat in dry salt, the Amish submerge it in a solution of water, salt, and sometimes sugar and spices. The liquid completely surrounds the meat, forcing the salt into every fiber. This makes brine curing faster and more consistent than dry curing, particularly for large cuts where dry salt struggles to penetrate the center. The brine's salt concentration is critical. Too weak, and the brine fails to inhibit bacterial growth. Too strong, and the meat becomes inedibly salty. The Amish traditionally test their brine with a raw egg. If the egg floats, the salt concentration is correct. If it sinks, more salt is needed. Meat sits submerged in the brine for days, sometimes weeks, depending on the size of the cut, weighted down to ensure no part surfaces and gets exposed to air. Brine-cured meat, when moved to a root cellar afterward, can last several months. Fermentation. Fermentation is the only preservation method on this list that intentionally uses bacteria. When the Amish make fermented sausage, they are not trying to eliminate bacteria. They are cultivating a specific strain of lactobacillus that converts sugars in the meat into lactic acid. That acid lowers the meat's pH to a level where harmful bacteria cannot survive. The process starts with ground pork, salt, and spices. The mixture is packed tightly into natural casings, traditionally made from cleaned pig intestines, and hung in a dedicated fermentation space, typically a cool cellar. The temperature in this space is kept between 55 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. That is warm enough for lactobacillus to thrive, but cool enough to prevent dangerous bacteria from gaining a foothold first. Over days and weeks, the sausage acidifies from the inside out, meaning that acid gradually makes the entire interior too sour for harmful bacteria to survive. The interior develops a dense, tangy flavor that no other preservation method produces. Properly fermented sausage can last several months without refrigeration. Confit. Confit is preservation and cooking happening at the same time. The Amish submerge cuts of meat, typically pork or duck, in their own rendered fat, which has been slowly extracted from the same cut, and cook them at a low temperature for several hours. The temperature stays between 180 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cook the meat through completely, but low enough to keep the fat from burning or breaking down. What happens during this process is precise. The heat drives out all remaining moisture from the meat. The fat fills every space left by moisture. By the time cooking is finished, the meat contains almost no water. The cooked meat is then packed into ceramic crocks and completely covered with the cooking fat. As the fat solidifies, it forms an airtight seal, identical in function to lard preservation, but with one difference. The meat inside has already been fully cooked and flavored by hours of submersion in fat. Confit stored in a cool root cellar can last up to 6 months. Potting. Potting is the simplest fat-based preservation method the Amish use, and in some ways, the most practical. Cooked meat is shredded or chopped into small pieces and packed tightly into a ceramic pot. The packing is deliberate. Any air pocket left in the meat is a space where bacteria can establish themselves. The meat is pressed down firmly, layer by layer, until the pot is full. Rendered fat is then poured over the surface and allowed to seep down through the meat, filling every remaining gap. A final thick layer is poured on top, sealing the surface completely from air and moisture. The difference between potting and confit is in the process. Confit cooks the meat in its own fat. Potting seals meat that has already been cooked separately. This makes potting faster and more flexible. Any leftover cooked meat can be potted, regardless of how it was originally prepared. Potted meat stored in a cool cellar can last up to 3 months.